Hello and welcome to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast. I'm your co-host, as always, Stephen Dickens, and I'm joined by Jared Clee. Hey, Jared, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Stephen. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good. Looking forward to this one. The pre-show kind of back and forth is going to make this one interesting, I think. So let's dive straight in. Let's get our listeners orientated. We're on to episode 11 of this podcast, which is frankly still amazing for me that we've managed to do 11 of these.
Astonishing and reasonably professionally,
I know,
despite our
right?
best attempts otherwise.
I know. So let's try and keep that trend going. So over the next 30 minutes, you'll get us talking about the mechanics and workings of money, technology, and crypto. We've got a pretty interesting episode this week. We're covering the newsletter that Jared's put out. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But just get our listeners orientated, Jared, if you would. What are we going to cover this week?
So it struck me, Stephen, as we talked last week about predictions for this upcoming year, a lot of what I'm excited about, a lot of what goes on in the industry is not stuff that's being hyped right now. It's not even stuff that was hyped last year. It's stuff that was hyped 5, 6, 10 years ago, but it takes time. Big transformations for industries always take real time, especially when we talk about regulated industries like financial services, banking, capital markets, stuff that really, first off, can't go offline. But secondly, there's a bunch of restrictions about what you can and can't do. It can take years, oftentimes decades, for meaningful transformations to take place. And oftentimes, well after the hype has left the news, is when the real stuff starts happening. And unless you're kind of keeping finger on the pulse, you lose track. But the result is you wake up one day and you're living in a new world.
And I think that's the crucial thing, and I'm guilty of this as the industry. I mean, we're always I was at CES last week. We're always talking about the new, we're talking about the metaverse. We're talking about digital transformation. We're talking about the cool cutting edge technology. Typically finds its way into our lives through a phone, through a sort of retail or B2C type lens. I think what we're talking about here is the heavy lifting that the businesses, in this particular case, banks, have to do way, way, way after it's been shown at a Money 2020 or one of the big conferences from at a keynote stage through to when it's actually the project's going live, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years later. So one of the first pieces, and you covered this in the newsletter, was cloud. Whether that's public cloud, whether that's private cloud, I don't think we'll distinguish here, but just cloud as a foundational technology. Some of the sectors outside of banking are a lot further ahead. I think if you looked at streaming TV to my house, I think universally they're all on public cloud platforms. Netflix, HBO, Max, Disney. I don't think anybody's building on-prem infrastructure for that. That's probably the furthest ahead. If you're talking about cryptocurrency trading platforms, I think they're probably all public cloud because they've come up in the last 13 years, maybe even in the last 5. Core banking and a lot of the banking infrastructure, though, is a lot slower on that adoption curve from a move to a, let's say, public cloud. Maybe they're faster ahead on the adoption of private cloud, but you talked about this in the newsletter, so let's kind of use that as a foundational technology and where we are from an adoption perspective.
Of course. And that Stephen, just to orient on timelines here, Amazon launches the first cloud in 2002. So we're basically 20 years after the original launch of cloud. And yet Accenture published recent numbers. We're looking at 8%. 8% of bank workloads have been moved to the cloud. Now, as we'll get into, there are good reasons for keeping some of those in your own data center, but certainly there's a lot of those that would benefit enormously from being run in the cloud. Now, there are a whole bunch of benefits you get. I'm going to hit on 3 that are going to be crucial for our conversation here. One, Stephen, is specialization. So the deep technology of hardware, of networking, and the like is, first off, really difficult to get expertise for. Those people are in short supply and generally very expensive. But two, it takes up a lot of time. It's mental energy that could be focused on saying, building something that's customer facing. And instead, you're having to develop this expertise on something that's basically infrastructure. It's like saying, I want to be a car manufacturer and I'm going to learn how to build roads. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. You'd rather outsource the building and maintaining of roads to somebody else and focus on building a car. So first thing cloud allows, it allows specialization by a financial services firm, and they're effectively able to outsource a lot of that core infrastructure work, the hardware, the networking, the like, to a third party like Amazon, like Google, and the like. Second thing, and this goes hand in hand, the financial services firm is able to narrow their focus. So rather than split themselves and have to work on two different things, they can just work on their core competencies. That's absolutely critical, Stephen, because it allows them to repurpose mental energy, board time, executive time, money into things that are actually driving net new revenue. By the way, that's also true for the cloud company. The cloud company is able to focus on, how do I build these massive scale data centers that serve many, 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 many people? So both are able to narrow their focus, the result of which is higher quality bank applications and services, financial market services, the like, and higher quality infrastructure. They're able to narrow their focus. The third, and this is a bit less obvious, if a bank or if an exchange keeps all of its technology in-house, it never has to learn how to collaborate with someone on the outside because all of the stuff happens internal. Well, the moment you introduce cloud, you're introducing a third party who's saying maintaining your databases and your servers and the like. You're forcing them the bank to interact with an external third party. That becomes a whole set of operational procedures. That becomes a bunch of security policies. That becomes a bunch of technical stuff that often manifests in an API, application programming interface, the way a very attractive way for two services to interact with one another. Where before, Stephen, pre-cloud, a third-party vendor who came in that you wanted to say adopt their technology and integrate it was often treated as a one-off project. Now we have a standardized, templatized way of how do you bring in third parties. So not only is a bank able to focus on their core competencies, their core tech, and get better at that, they're better able to bring in third parties who may specialize in other pieces of it and attach it to what they're doing. The collection of this, Stephen, is absolutely awesome.
And I don't disagree with any one of those three, but there is trade-offs, as there is always trade-offs. I think what we're seeing, why it's only 8%, is because there is some significant trade-off. So if you play positive and I play negative for a moment, there's security, one of the foundational elements of outsourcing, or for that matter, putting stuff in the public cloud, is it's not your person that has access to the server administration. There's a whole movement around confidential computing that's trying to fix this, but that's still pretty nascent technology. The person at Amazon is administering your server and they don't work for you. That's a concern that you can manage and you can work around, but you do have to manage that. You can train that person can be trained by Amazon, but ultimately you're susceptible to the Edward Snowden style attack. Edward Snowden had the right credentials, had the right access, had been enabled to do the things that he did. The fact that he was then able to do them was because he was a nefarious actor. So that's that person working for Amazon, not for you. And I'm picking on Amazon. It could be Google, it could be Microsoft, but working for the public cloud provider. The other piece is performance. The speed of light is still the speed of light. Nobody's fixed that one yet. To get it a round trip to the cloud provider and back may be a challenge. And the final one, and we saw this happen starkly in December, was around availability. The public cloud service level agreements are 3 nines. From an availability point of view, that's translating to an amount of downtime every year. If your application can't survive with that level of application downtime or server downtime or infrastructure downtime, then you need to architect differently. So if it's baked into the SLA that you're going to get 3 nines availability, that's what you're paying for, and that is what you're going to get. If your application requires 6 nines availability, don't put it on the cloud. I think the point where I'm finally coming to, and people who know me say this, because the car was invented doesn't mean all other forms of transport therefore should be thrown away. The way to look at the car, and particularly to look at the cloud, is if Uber and Hertz and Enterprise and Lyft are renting space in a vehicle, either for short journeys or over a day, and that's the cloud. There's still and I'm stretching the analogy now, but if the cloud is kind of x86 and modern compute, there's still a space for every other type of chip architecture out there, because certain journeys are best done on the train, certain journeys are best done by plane. I think what you've got to do is have a sort of fit for purpose type of methodology. I don't think anybody in the banking industry thinks they're going to go 100% to the cloud. It's a question of where between probably 8% and maybe 70% is the right answer, and what moves first.
Agreed, Stephen. And there's nuance to what you said that I'll emphasize. There are certain types of workloads, certain types of challenges that you want running on premise, oftentimes running on a mainframe or otherwise. Good example, and one I always come back to, let's take us out of the bank into something more familiar. If you're driving down a road in your car, the processing you want, if there's someone standing out in the road and your car is computer vision, the processing you want to recognize that there's a person in the road and to slam on the brakes, that is not a cloud workload. That speed of light problem you talked about, you don't want the latency, you don't want the challenges of connectivity, of downtime if you're sending a signal back and forth. You want that in the car being processed on the chips there. The flip side is the really intensive model training so that the computer vision system can understand what a person is. Well, we can do that over long periods of time. We want to take advantage of a massively powerful system. That can be done in the cloud. So that model building and model training is done in a cloud environment that is then deployed to a system that lives on the car for that fast think. Now, I'm abusing Kahneman's work here, but what I'm really talking about is a fast think and a slow think system. The fast think system fits very nicely close to the problem. The slow think can live elsewhere.
Exactly. So, I mean, we're seeing this with chip architectures, more specialization than we have ever, different chip architectures coming for different use cases, edge cases, AI cases. People aren't trying to use that general purpose processor design, which maybe they were 10, 15 years ago, to service every use case. We're now seeing specialization. So that can apply to infrastructure, it can apply to the chips.
So what I'm going to bring us back to here, Stephen, is in a world where you have both, you get these advantages of cloud, but you've still got some stuff living on the mainframe and otherwise in your own data centers. You need a way for this to play nice with each other. Mm-hmm. And that is part of what we've, as the cloud has started to mature, one, figuring out what types of problems should live where, but two, building the interfaces on top of that mainframe, on top of that internal data center that allows you to interface back and forth with the cloud. And that's absolutely critical for where we're going and remains a work in progress.
So now we've laid that sort of cloud foundation in. You, in the newsletter, went into sort of how that's being applied to various markets, particular participants in those markets. First off, you talked about capital markets, so maybe let's pivot off the technology stack for a moment and get into that particular market. So, where do you see that transformation in the capital market space?
So there's an awesome revolution happening in equity markets, stocks, as well as in debt. The equity markets are a bit further along. So we saw this, Stephen, with the craziness of GameStop not too long ago, expose some of the breaking points in the markets today. GameStop, we saw unusually high trading volumes. We also saw Robinhood get a phone call from DTCC that said, hey, we need you to put up $3 billion in margin. Now, just for a bit of a highlight here, if you're Robinhood and you're a broker facilitating trades, the way it actually works is if I send a trade to Robinhood, it works its way through a bunch of pipes and plumbing to a centralized system called DTCC. That trade, my order, even though I see it settle instantly, I get my stocks instantly, or I get my money instantly, it actually takes 2 days for the stocks and the cash to move under the covers. So Robinhood, as my broker, is required to put up capital called margin, so that in the event that, say, I fail to deliver my cash or somebody fails to deliver their stocks and whatnot, the system as a whole remains robust. Now, when trading volumes can go crazy, if you're a broker, you can get a phone call like what happened with Robinhood until you need to put up a lot more money immediately. In the case of Robinhood, they had 24 hours, or we're simply going to shut off your access to the system. That's, by the way, $3 billion was more than Robinhood had raised in their entire history up until that point. It was a wild amount of money. Now, what's happening, Stephen, is first, DTCC has been around for 40 years, 50 years, and we've made meaningful improvements on the technology, but we continue to follow an architecture, a pattern that's quite old. Paxos has come along and said, wait, we've got this new thing called blockchain. What if we could use that to go create instant settlement? We're going to make it backwards compatible so we can support your 2-day settlement time, but we can also offer you instant settlement or intraday settlement. On top of that, DTCC, because stocks and money move in 2 different places, stocks are recorded on one database, money on another, it doesn't always match up. And in the case of GameStop, we had about $160 million of failed trades. In the case of Lehman Brothers, when they went bankrupt, we had $500 billion of failed trades. It took 6 weeks to work that all out, meaning part of the equity moved and the stocks didn't and the cash didn't, or vice versa. With Paxos' system, you can move the stocks and the cash at the same time. You can ensure both go through or neither go through. Stephen, I highlight this because this is the first time in almost 50 years we've had a material rethinking of how you could architect how stocks move. It's wild. It's absolutely wild. But this isn't a new conversation. It's taken Paxos 5, 6, 7 years to get to this point where they're now in pilot mode. They're looking to apply for a formal clearing license, which will allow them to do this at scale. And what's really cool is this has forced DTCC to step up to the plate. DTCC now has their own program to compete with Paxos.
But blockchain technology, probably 2014 was the start of the hype cycle about that technology, maybe 7 years ago. And we're now seeing them start to get into probably, they're on from MVP, but they're probably into early pilot stage.
So Paxos is in a live pilot, has been for about 12 months or so now.
But to speak to our wider point of this podcast, we're talking about a technology that's 7 or 8 years old. They're in a pilot of, I think, 6 or 7 banks.
Correct.
We're probably 5 years away, maybe even 10 away from full adoption of their technology stack. That's a significant, you look at blockchain in banking, and I know you know the space better than I do. We were out there touting this 2014, 2015, the length of time to get that into full production. That's both a technology maturation issue, but also the regulatory time frame to get that technology to be adopted, reviewed, approved. So, I mean, is that the typical sort of life cycle you see for these, you know, hits the press, is the sort of early kind of stage adoption, maybe even 10 to 15 years behind that?
Easily, easily, because it's a really good example. A stock settlement system, equity settlement, you don't have room for errors. You
Mhm.
not only need the technology to mature to the point where you trust it, you then need to build an entirely new version on top of it of how the system could work. You need to retrain people. You need to build processes around it. It will raise new types of risk you hadn't thought about before. You got to build risk management around it. Now, all of this, Stephen, is only possible because of the cloud. All of a sudden, we've developed as a bank, as a financial services company, we've developed third-party vendor management as a core competency. So the fact that, Stephen, we can now do this in 10 or 15 years is to say it's faster underplays it. We've gone 30, 40, 50 years without reimagining what equity settlement could be. And it's only because of cloud. It's not happening faster. It's happening at all because of the competencies we've developed with the move to cloud.
So, if that's been the transformation in the capital market space, what are you seeing happening within money movement? I think the most interesting piece for this for me is where the cryptocurrency kind of space is starting to bleed into how do I move money. I wrote recently about the stuff that Strike is doing, and some of their infrastructure, the sort of finality of moving stuff across on a blockchain DLT type space. What are you seeing in the kind of money movement space? And I know you covered it in the newsletter, so let's maybe unpack that.
So I'm going to avoid the cryptocurrency word by design, Stephen. But I want to highlight a company called Tacit, who's a startup that's been doing really cool work. You probably haven't heard of them, but if you go look at the big exchanges and their ability, if you want, Stephen, to convert your dollars into whatever at the exchange, Bitcoin or what have you, if you are an exchange and you want to move money between your subsidiaries because you've got too much cash in the US and you need money in the UK arm, Tacit is probably under the covers. And what the way they got there is they're engaged with banks like Signature Bank and they tokenize deposits. So what that means is rather than having to go through the legacy system of moving money through, say, ACH or wires or the like, Tacit has built a parallel network that creates a digital representation of money that's in a deposit account and allows you to do the ledger updates with the UK arm to claim those deposits on the UK arm from the US or the like. Now, where it started, Stephen, is in intra-bank money movement. So say if I have multiple accounts at Signature or the like, I can move money among them. Or if I'm Coinbase and I have multiple different customers moving money among them, where it's gone to, and I love, is Tacit has spun up along with and helped fund a industry-owned joint venture. It's really a consortium. And what they're doing is they're turning over all of the tech, all of the network, all of the IP, all of the operations into a new joint venture that's set up to be owned by the banks themselves. And just a few months ago, they demoed the first interbank money movement.
So
Again, here,
let me be the devil's advocate. Swift,
so Swift is a messaging protocol. So we need to differentiate.
but doesn't that move money between banks today?
It does not. So two different systems. Swift allows you to send the messages to authorize payments in between banks. So for instance, I need to check that the account exists. I need to check that the account is not owned by a terrorist. There's authorizations that need to be sent in between the banks. Once I get those authorizations, the messages, I still need to actually move the money. The update the ledger and say, I'm going to move it from this account to your account at me, and then update. That happens over a separate system. It can happen over wire. It can happen through automated clearinghouses. There's a couple of them. It can happen through FedWire in the US if they have access to the Fed.
So we're
Tacit
talking about
brings
the tacit system replacing not just Swift, but the ACH, FedWire, wire transfer type layer as well. So it's kind of that whole stack. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right, Stephen. And not only is it replacing the full stack potentially, it does it 24/7 by 365. Anytime, any place you can move money in between banks, which is anyone who's tried to send a wire, for instance, today knows that's a batch system that happens 2 or 3 times a day. And you're kind of blind to what's happening and you hope the money shows up. And by the way, it doesn't run after 5 or on weekends.
So Europe's tried to make some strides in the space with faster payments. Is this the kind of next turn of the crank, but replacing the technology stack more fundamentally? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I would highlight the U.S. is a bit further behind on faster payments, but it's being run out of the Boston Federal Reserve. They do have quite an aggressive timeline to start rolling that out. They've been hiring in developers and product managers, so there is movement in the U.S. It's just a bit further behind.
So where do you see that money movement space going? I mean, I think, I'm all in on DLT and blockchain technology. I think this is one of the better use cases. Where do you see this space?
So what I'd highlight here, we saw in capital markets and equity, we have DTCC coming up and now basically trying to compete with what Paxos is going live with. We're actually seeing, Stephen, the same thing in money movement. JP Morgan, it's under the Onyx brand, but a system called Link that's effectively competing with Swift on the messaging, and then JP Morgan Coin for the actual money movement. Again, runs on the same blockchain system, but 2 different sets of services. I highlight that because in the money movement, we're now seeing 2 competing networks. One launched by Tacit into the industry-owned consortium, and the second, JP Morgan, getting many global banks. They have about 400 banks signed letters of intent. They've got about 25 actually using the service today. We've got 2 competing networks. So, Stephen, what I expect a series of networks to emerge. The Tacit one is US focused. The JP Morgan one is global in nature. I would expect countries with robust banking systems like the UK to probably end up with their own at first. China probably end up with its own at first. At some point, we're going to have an interoperability conversation so money can move cross-network. But I expect competing networks in the meantime.
And we're still talking about an adoption curve and a deployment curve of 10, 15, maybe even 20 years before that vision that Tacit and JP Morgan are seeing is fully deployed and fully adopted. Would that be a fair statement?
It's exactly right. And we'll likely start, Stephen, with low-hanging fruit use cases. So cryptocurrency companies, exchanges, and hedge funds and so on are a really good example of low-hanging fruit, because since all of their investments, most of their assets are already on a blockchain, it's actually a fairly big hurdle for them to go and integrate with the existing payment system. So they're a really easy use case. Hey, we'll make something easy for you to get started on. For most of the rest of the business, if I'm running Shopify or what have you, that's not really a concern. That's going to take much longer to move over. Where we do see other use cases, and JP Morgan has started to tackle some of these, they're on track, I believe it's this quarter, to launch something called Check Match. Stephen, checks are still a tens of billions of dollar industry in the US. Something on the order of 75% of all interbusiness transactions are done via check, which is an absurd statement. JP Morgan's Link, and eventually coupled the messaging, and eventually coupled with JP Morgan Coin, allows you to completely get rid of the check. Now, critically here, it's faster, it can be done anytime, and it's cheaper. So that's, again, a really good use case of it's that 10x better you're looking for. But we're going to have this long tail of I'm trying to pay for Shopify stuff. That's going to take a decade, 2 decades or more, because the technology's got to get a heck of a lot better to see a 10x improvement over how we do it, to the point where a traditional payment processor goes, yeah, you know what, I should switch over as well.
And I think that's the key point here. We're not saying the legacy is bad, and we're not saying the new is better. We're saying that there's use cases for both, and you should adopt what you need to get you where you need to go over the right time horizon. Throwing away your entire checking system as a bank just to move to the new technology for some of those use cases that don't need it yet, probably not the way to go. So I think this evolution curve that we're talking about here is really disconnecting from the hype and having a thoughtful conversation as a business leader of going, what's the use case I'm architecting for? What do I need to do today? What can wait? And building that programmatic view of maybe it takes me 20, 30 years to get to the final end of this project, but where do I go first?
Absolutely. It's that risk weighted return, and the return needs to be large. And with any new, especially hype technology, for most people, the return won't be there. The challenge in financial services is that the risk is almost certainly there, and in a very large way. So the technology has to mature even further than it would if, say, you were building an app to order pizza, in order to decrease the risk quotient so that that return makes sense. Once you get over that hurdle, now you've still got all the normal regulatory stuff of what does it mean to deploy? How do I manage risk ongoing, et cetera, et cetera. It takes years and oftentimes decades.
We'll start to bring us home then. We're 32 minutes in. We never hit our 30-minute timeline we set ourselves every week. So summarize us up. You know, long newsletter, lots of themes in there. We've spent the last 30 minutes talking through this. Summarize us up for the listeners of kind of what are the key takeaways.
Key takeaways. One, we're still in the early innings of cloud. For financial services, we could broaden that to other highly regulated industries, medical records, and the like. So the advantages, those kind of novelty you're getting from cloud, the ability to innovate faster, we're still in the early innings. So if you are a business helping people move to cloud, lots of business still to pick up. If you are someone who's looking to build a new service available to a bank or an exchange or what have you that couldn't have been done before but can now because cloud, we've got lots of years of fruit for building ahead of us. The second thing I'd highlight is for those folks who are looking and trying to understand what are the mega trends, keep looking at the stuff deep in the bowels of the system, these transformations that take decades, because as they come online, they're going to open up new opportunities that we're not even paying attention to today. And these will take decades to open up. Many of them, core banking is a really good example here. Never mind the headline numbers, 3% of core banking has moved to the cloud. There are aspects of that are really good to move to cloud. That it is a massive market. That is a tens of billions of dollars a year market that all of a sudden is starting to become fair game to build a new company for the first time in decades. It's worth paying attention to and watching that adoption, because we're watching the opening of multi-billion dollar markets that simply were inaccessible before. And now all of a sudden, years after the hype, are good places to go build.
Exactly. And I mean, I'm working with organizations like Temenos and Zafin that are in that space on that intersection. So I think this is a huge topic. We could have done a 4-hour podcast on this, let alone the 34 minutes we're in. I think we've got to bring it home. What would your final 3 sort of takeaways be for people who are listening to this, being pitched to maybe by technology vendors? What are the sort of 3 kind of punchy bullets that you'd wrap us up with, Jared?
One, the hype is real, but expect it to take longer than you think it will. It may be worth buying yesterday's hype because the technology has matured to where it needs to, given your risk profile. Second thing, it's going to force you, this adoption of new technology is going to force you to develop new competencies that you hadn't before. Third-party vendor risk management being a really good one. But again, all the operations and processes around engaging with them, also going to be a new muscle to develop. The third point, Stephen, is that same muscle, while it's an investment today, becomes a massive advantage tomorrow because it allows you, now that you know how to engage with third parties, now that you know how to share data with them, it opens up an entire world of startups and later stage technology companies that you can now partner with. They can bring capabilities to bear, and you've got a whole program already set up to engage with them. Use it. It's a massive potential win.
I think that's a fantastic way to summarize. So you've been listening to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast, where Jared and I every week get into the makings and workings of fintech, money, and cryptocurrency. If you like the show, then please click and subscribe on your various podcast channels. Check us out on YouTube. We look a lot better than you would think based on listening to us. As always, if you've got complaints or negative feedback, send that to Cleebeard on Twitter. That's Jared, by the way. If you've got wonderful things to say, send that to @StephenDickens3. Seriously, though, please click and subscribe and like the channel. It helps us as we try and build this beyond episode 11 and continue to build this platform. We'll be back next week. So thanks very much for listening to the Fat Tailed Thoughts podcast.